Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine is in its 21st day, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian demands are becoming more realistic in ongoing negotiations to end the assault. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he sees some hope for a compromise. Zelensky said Tuesday he doesn't expect Ukraine to join NATO anytime soon. Later today, the Ukrainian leader is virtually addressing the U.S. Congress, where he's expected to repeat calls for more military reinforcement and a no-fly zone. On Tuesday, the prime ministers of Poland, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic held a joint news conference with President Zelensky in Kiev. This is the Czech prime minister.
You are fighting for your lives, for your families, for your country, for freedom. But we know you are fighting also for our lives and for our freedom. We know it. And probably the main goal of our visit, or main message of our mission, is to say you are not alone. Our countries stand with you. Europe stands with your country.
Ukraine's capital is now under a curfew as Russia continues to bomb residential areas. Earlier today, Russian forces shelled a 12-story apartment building in Kyiv. Ukraine's other cities also remain under attack or Russian occupation. On Tuesday, survivors of a Russian airstrike on a residential block in Kharkiv were evacuated by rescue workers.
Brotherly nation, my mother comes from Borisov. I have relatives in Kursk. How could this monster, oh my God, monster, come up with something like this? To destruct everything. People are starving. There is no water, no wood for heating, and he decided to destroy a city. In the 21st century, a beautiful city.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis continues to worsen. Over 3 million people have now become refugees. On Tuesday, President Zelensky said 100 children have been killed since the start of the invasion. UNICEF says a child war refugee is being created every second in Ukraine. 2 Fox News journalists, the camera operator Pierre Zarzewski and producer Alexandra Kuvshanova, were killed earlier this week when their vehicle was struck outside Kyiv. Fox News correspondent Benjamin Hall was injured in the attack and hospitalized. Ukrainian officials say he lost part of his leg. At least 5 media professionals have been killed since the start of the invasion 3 weeks ago. To see our segment on Brent Renaud, the award-winning U.S. journalist who was killed in Ukraine, go to democracynow.org. Meanwhile, the Russian TV producer, Marina Oshanikova, was released Tuesday after being fined for calling on Russians to join anti-war protests in a pre-recorded video. On Monday, she burst onto the set of a live Russian news broadcast yelling, "Stop the war," while holding a sign that said, "They're lying to you here." Russia withdrew from the Council of Europe Tuesday ahead of its expected expulsion from Europe's rights watchdog. Amid its increasing isolation, Moscow also announced sanctions against President Biden and top U.S. officials, as well as Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. This came as the European Union approved a new wave of sanctions against Russia, including banning investments in Russian energy, luxury goods, exports and imports of steel products. The UK also blacklisted hundreds of powerful Russians and imposed new import tariffs. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned Moscow could stage a false flag operation in Ukraine to launch a chemical weapons attack. President Biden signed a bill Tuesday which includes $13.6 billion in additional military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. It's part of a $1.5 trillion spending measure to fund the U.S. government through the 2022 fiscal year. The measure, however, was stripped of funding for the pandemic after Democrats could not agree on where that money would come from. This comes as the White House renewed urgent calls for more coronavirus funding. This is Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
We've outlined the severe and immediate consequences that the United States will face if Congress fails to provide us with $22.5 billion in emergency funding to fight COVID-19. Those consequences are dire. Fewer monoclonal antibodies sent to states, an inability to purchase additional treatments, fewer tests available to Americans, less surveillance for future variants, and a risk of running short on vaccines.
In other coronavirus news, Pfizer-BioNTech has requested emergency use authorization from the FDA for an additional vaccine booster dose for adults 65 and older. Meanwhile, in Florida, Raul Pino, the health administrator for Orange County, has been reinstated. He'd been suspended after promoting vaccines to his staff. In global pandemic news, Politico is reporting a possible breakthrough in discussions at the World Trade Organization for an intellectual property waiver for COVID vaccines. The waiver would reportedly only apply to vaccines in its initial phase and would be limited to certain countries. The deal still needs to be approved by EU countries and some WTO members. Israeli forces fatally shot 3 Palestinians in separate attacks Tuesday in the occupied West Bank and in the Bedouin city of Rahat. The youngest victim was 17-year-old Nader Ayan, who was shot during a raid on the Balata refugee camp in the West Bank city of Nablus. 19 migrants are missing and presumed dead after their boat capsized off the coast of Libya over the weekend. 3 people were rescued. 1 body was found. The passengers were believed to be from Egypt and Syria. In Peru, President Pedro Castillo Tuesday rejected allegations of corruption after Congress voted to begin impeachment proceedings against him this week. Castillo, a leftist former teacher and union leader, vowed to correct errors made by his administration and signaled the need for a larger government overhaul.
El Perú vive hoy una crisis institucional sin precedentes.
Peru is currently experiencing an unprecedented constitutional crisis involving the 3 levels of government. This has a negative impact on the quality of the public services that we as a state provide to the population. This situation cannot continue.
President Castillo's approval rating has plummeted to 26% since taking office in July. Peru has had 5 presidents since 2016. A new UN report finds the Burmese military has committed systematic human rights violations, many amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity since the February 1st, 2021 coup.
The report sets out Myanmar's military and security forces' flagrant disregard for human life, bombarding populated areas with airstrikes and heavy weapons, and deliberately targeting civilians, some of whom have been shot in the head, burned to death, arbitrarily arrested, tortured, or used as human shields.
Back in the U.S., Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, revealed she attended last year's January 6th Stop the Steal rally. Ginny Thomas said she left before Trump's speech and before the deadly attack on the Capitol because she got cold. Thomas called the morning's events, quote, a peaceful gathering of Trump supporters. In related news, a Florida judge ordered Enrique Tarrio, the former head of Proud Boys, be detained while he awaits trial on charges related to the insurrection. Evidence cited in Tarrio's indictment included a 9-page plan to storm government buildings on January 6 in Washington, D.C., titled 1776 Returns. The document does not specifically mention attacking the Capitol, and it's not known who produced it. Sarah Bloom Raskin has withdrawn as the nominee for a top regulatory post at the Federal Reserve. The move came after conservative Democratic Senator Joe Manchin joined Republican senators to oppose her confirmation. Sarah Bloom Raskin had vowed to focus on how the climate crisis threatens the economy. Here in New York City, street vendors held a sleepout in a rally in front of Governor Kathy Hochul's office, calling for her to lift a cap on licenses for sellers. Thousands of street vendors, the majority of them from immigrant communities, are unlicensed and vulnerable to hefty fines or harassment while working.
Just like you, we are mothers. We have children. We are fighting so you can take action. Grant us vendor licenses so we can live and work with dignity.
Tuesday's action was also the kickoff for a 150-mile march from New York City to Albany, where immigrant workers will demand New York State expand funding and protections for those excluded from government pandemic relief in the New York State budget. Disney workers are staging a series of walkouts after CEO Bob Chapek initially refused to condemn Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay legislation and for donating to politicians who back the measure, which bans discussions of sexuality and gender identity in schools. The virtual and in-person walkouts were organized by LGBTQ+ employees of Disney who are calling for the company to take action to protect workers in Florida from the legislation. Police in Washington, D.C. arrested a suspect in a string of shootings targeting unhoused men in D.C. and New York. 2 of the shootings were fatal. 30-year-old Gerald Brevard faces multiple charges, including first-degree murder. A man's been charged with attempted murder as a hate crime after he brutally attacked a 67-year-old woman of Asian descent in Yonkers, New York. He called her an anti-Asian sexist slur before he repeatedly punched her in the head in a building's vestibule. The shocking assault was captured on a security camera. Anti-Asian hate crimes have skyrocketed since the start of the pandemic. And today marks 1 year since the mass shooting at 3 Atlanta spas, which killed 8 people, 6 of them women of Asian descent. Commemorations and rallies are taking place across the United States today. And a bipartisan bill to make daylight savings permanent passed the U.S. Senate Tuesday by unanimous consent and now heads to the House. Backers of the measure argue more sunlight hours could help conserve energy, be a boon for business, and improve mental and physical health. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.